hungry.
Haruspex.
First to gobble up the most marbles wins.
Haruspex. Haruspex. Haruspex.
What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and we are doing another Datasheet deep dive. This is going to be the first deep dive chosen by patrons. So what we're going to be doing in the future for Datasheet deep dive is that members of the Tactical Tortoise Patreon, which you can join over at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise, will be able to submit suggestions for future datasheets to talk about in this series. And the overwhelming majority of requests for this last video were to talk about Tyranid datasheets, and in particular, the Haruspex got mentioned, and that is what we're going to be covering today. As always, if you enjoy the series of video, a like and a subscribe to the channel helps a ton. I really appreciate everyone who's joined our community in the last couple weeks and everyone who's enjoying this Datasheet deep dive series. In other sort of housekeeping news, I'm going to be trying to live stream a little bit more often. In the past, I've normally restricted my live streaming mostly to covering T5S2 online 40k events, but I'm trying to stream potentially every day is going to be the new goal, at least every weekday. A combination of T5S2 events and other 40k games, either casual games from the Discord community that you can join in the link down in the description, or games that I'm playing, so live gameplay style stuff. So that's going to be sick. We'll see how well I can keep that schedule, but stay tuned for lots of live streaming coming out of the channel in the not-too-distant future. I should mention as well that that live streaming has been made possible by the patrons. I was working off an old laptop that was ages and ages old. It had just incredibly outdated equipment. It was really failing, and I wasn't able to live stream over the last couple weeks because I was really having a lot of trouble with it. But thanks to everybody's support of the channel, and especially the support of the members over on the Patreon, I was able to build myself a brand new computer. It's much nicer, and hopefully I'm going to be able to do a lot more flashier stuff on the channel. So huge thanks to everyone over on the Patreon. I'll throw their names up in the video now. Normally do a credits at the end of the video, but we're going to do one right now just to thank all of those people. So big shout out to them, and let's get into this Datasheet deep dive. So this is going to be a little bit of a break from the other datasheets that we've covered so far, because so far we've only covered new Space Marine releases, and now we're going to be going back to a very much older datasheet and talking about some Tyranids. Obviously, I love Tyranids, and today we're going to be talking about a model that I haven't really played too much, the reasons for which I'm sure we'll get to in this video, and that is the Haruspex, the hungry hippo of the 41st millennium. So before we get into the datasheet, what I'm going to talk about in this video is going to be a little different than the format that I use for the Space Marine videos. And that's because Tyranids tend to be a little bit less compartmentalized than Space Marines are. Basically, the Tyranid faction is kind of split between having a focus on monsters and having a focus on massed infantry. And so when you take a unit like the Haruspex, who is a monster, like half of the abilities in the faction interact favorably with it. So I'm going to approach this in a little bit different of a direction than I do the Space Marine videos. I'm going to start by talking about the unit and its abilities and the attributes, how you want to use it on the table. Then I'm going to move into some very specific synergies, basically abilities or stratagems that affect this unit type specifically. We'll go from there to talking about other units that interact well with it in the Tyranid Codex, as well as psychic powers and stratagems. Then we'll move on to Hive Fleet specific synergies, and in there we'll talk about some of the Hive Fleet specific abilities that can affect it, including their special psychic powers. So we're going to break this datasheet deep dive up a little bit differently. So what is a Haruspex? I imagine a lot of people watching this video probably will have never heard of one or seen one on the table before, because they very rarely see play, but they have a pretty interesting stat line. This is a big old toughness 8 monster with a big old mouth that is going to be trying to eat all your infantry up and gobble them up and use them to fuel its rapacious appetite. Obviously, they come in as an elite's choice for 170 points or 9 power level, so a pretty hefty price tag on this guy, but for that price tag, you get Toughness 8 with 13 wounds. So immediately, this is a pretty tanky guy. It's not, you know, Land Raider Repulsor levels of difficulty to kill, but Toughness 8, it's a really good breakpoint, especially in the metagame right now. Melta is everywhere, and getting to that Toughness 8 threshold means that Melta is going to be winning you on 4s rather than 3s, and if you have any other buffs on him at all, you can make that even harder to take this guy down. And we'll talk about some of the defensive buffs that you can layer onto that pretty solid stat line later in the video. The other thing is that 13 wounds is actually a very unique number of wounds. I mean, you see most vehicles come in at 10 or 12. 13 you never see very often, and that's actually a really good number of wounds to have. And that is because having an odd number of wounds means that multi-damage weapons have a lot harder of a time taking out this Haruspex. Basically, if you're hitting it with the damage 2 through 4, it takes an entire extra hit to kill the Haruspex, an entire extra unsaved wound, over a normal 12 wound model. And this guy comes in the kit alongside the Exocrine, which is built off the same chassis, and the Exocrine only has 12 wounds. And so if you play those two next to each other, you actually notice the difference between that 12 and 13 wound count a lot. Whether that's worth the price tag, I don't know. We'll talk about that later. It's also move 7. And comes in with 4 base attacks and a weapon skill ballistic skill of 4+ at a base strength of 7 on its top profile. Now, here's where things get kind of off the rails, because this is essentially a melee-only monster, and it's coming in with 4 attacks, weapon skill, ballistic skill 4. It's a little awkward, but there are some ways to improve that. It has a whole smorgasbord of weapons. One of them is a grasping tongue, an assault 1 weapon that when it kills someone, it can heal itself a wound, and this is going to be a theme as we talk about the Haruspex. It also, speaking of that theme, has this Rapacious Hunger ability, which says, one part of it says that at the end of a fight phase in which it kills somebody, it also regains a wound. So essentially, anytime it can shove an infantry bottle into its mouth, it's going to be gaining 1 wound from that. Although, it's not just infantry. You can eat vehicles too, if it ever gets to that point. Now, it has 2 different profiles for its melee weapons. It has a Ravenous Maw. Its big old mouth is going to start at strength 7, -1 for D3 damage, so kind of like an autocannon equivalent, a bit of a profile, but it makes D3 hit rolls for every attack it makes. So coming out of that 4 attacks, you're probably going to average around 8 total attacks with its Ravenous Maw if you're putting them all into the Maw attacks. Now, the other half of that Rapacious Hunger ability, every time it kills a model with its Maw attack, it then also gets to attack with its Shoveling Claws. And the claws are the big beat stick on this guy. This is what it's going to be using to kill vehicles and to really crack hard armor. It's coming out the gate at strength 14, -3 for D6 damage. Now, the number of attacks that you can generate from that is not capped. So potentially, you could be, if you roll all 5s and 6s on your D3s with the Ravenous Maw attacks, converting your 4 base attacks into those, you could be swinging 12 times, and if you convert 100% of those into like single wound models that you get to kill, you could then also make 12 attacks with its Rapacious Hunger. So potentially this thing could throw 24 attacks out. Now, it's probably never going to do that, but that's the top end. If we're living in magical Christmas land, that's what this monster could do potentially. Now, from that, what we can see is that what it really wants to do is wade into single wound models and eat a ton of them and use that to fuel a ton of claw attacks that it can then either take against a vehicle that it's also in melee with, which would, I mean, that's the most magical of magical Christmas lands, but it can also just take a bunch of really high impact attacks into that unit and kill a whole bunch of them. Now, I think on average, you're probably going to make 8 attacks with the mouth and convert maybe 4 or 5 of those with some buffs that we'll talk about later. Obviously, just using its weapon skill, ballistic skill 4, it's going to miss half of those and then like fail to wound 1. So you probably only kill 3 models, make 3 attacks with the claws, maybe kill 1 or 2. If you can buff it up a little bit, you can probably get 10 kills on average out of this against like a single wound model. You know, if you're a single wound unit, excuse me, like an Orc Boy Squad or Imperial Guardsman, like a big horde of guys. And 10 models in melee, I mean, that's not a lot. That's not a ton, especially for the point cost, but it is something. And obviously, the ceiling on it is much higher, so it could potentially go absolutely crazy. It can fight again. It can do all sorts of stuff. So obviously, it wants to get stuck into a bunch of infantry, and that's kind of further facilitated by these other abilities that it has. It has an explode ability, frenzied death throws. Now, a lot of Tyranid monsters have a death throws ability where they explode, quote unquote, for D3 mortals at 3 inches on a 6. This one comes in at flat 3. I kind of wish it exploded a little bit more often. That would be kind of cool, but it just explodes on a 6, but it hits you for 3. So if it gets stuck into your opponent's army, it does a bunch of damage. It's trying to engage as much stuff as possible. You kill it, it blows up for 3 mortal wounds. Sweet. It also has this acid blood rule where if for every wound it takes in the fight phase on a 6, it can deal a mortal wound back to you. That will very rarely come up. Obviously, it only has 13 wounds, so on average, it's only going to deal 2 mortals back if you kill it entirely in the fight phase, which is going to be pretty rare. So that's kind of flavor text, honestly, on this datasheet. So all in all, what we want want to be doing with this is getting it into a bunch of models that it can kill easily with its Ravenous Maw weapon, and then convert those into big shoveling claw attacks. So the best case scenario is it engages a unit of like 10 guardsmen and then also a Leman Russ. It kills all the guardsmen and uses those to convert into shoveling claw attacks to kill the Leman Russ. It has the potential to do that. Whether your opponent sets up for that, it really requires your opponent to cooperate with you pretty hardcore to make that happen. It's relatively tanky, so it can get there sometimes on its tankiness alone, although being a single model unit, big monster, in the current metagame is a little bit tough because, you know, Eradicators exist and they're going to blow this thing up. But the other thing that's kind of holding it back is a movement of 7. That's good for an infantry unit, but this is not an infantry unit. This is a monster, so it can't go through breachable terrain, it can't really climb very well, it can't go up scalable terrain. It's going to be really hampered by the terrain on the table, and being only at move 7 without any ways to increase that on its datasheet is going to be really rough for this poor guy. So now that we've talked about the datasheet and its strengths and weaknesses, let's talk about some of the stratagems that call out the Haruspex specifically, or at least this monster unit type very specifically. Now, there are a couple that it's essentially based around. There are 2 stratagems that name Haruspexes specifically. The first one is Feeding the Hunger, and this is came out of Blood of Baal and is a real big deal. Now, I mentioned before, a big deal with the Haruspex is that it is a melee-only unit, and it's saddled with this weapon skill 4. That's garbage. There's no real way to spin that. 4 plus weapon skill on a melee-only unit is real bad. But Feeding the Hunger came into Blood of Baal to help buff it up a little bit. It's a 1 CP strat. You can target the Haruspex when it goes to fight. It rerolls all of its hit rolls. Great. Perfect. Unfortunately, this is kind of a theme of Tyranids. We'll talk about it in the wrap-up of the video, but Tyranids tend to tie a lot of unit-specific buffs and abilities to finite resources, and this is an example of that. So essentially, you're going to want to be holding 1 or 2 CP every time this thing fights to buff it up and make its attacks reliable. Now, they're very reliable once you get there. Hitting on 4s rerolling is just fine. You're going to hit 75% of the time, so if you generate those average of 8 attacks with its claws, you're going to hit 6 of them, and then wound on 2s or 3s against infantry, which is pretty good. And there are a bunch of ways to buff that as well. The other one that could potentially be useful is the Grisly Feast stratagem. This is another Blood of Baal one. This is a weird stratagem. It's leadership manipulation, which is typically bad, so there's a reason you don't see it used very often. But what this stratagem does is add 1 to morale tests for enemy units within 6 inches of this guy. It could potentially be useful, especially since the difference between passing and failing a morale test now is a lot greater than it was in 8th edition. If you fail the morale test, especially on like a big unit of 30 models, then you could potentially be killing 5 or 6 of those guys solely as a result of that morale test. If you're adding 1 to an already difficult morale test in 8th edition, it was just going to kill 1 extra model for 1 CP, which is not a great trade. But potentially, you could be hitting somebody with a big swath of combat attrition tests just by adding 1 to their morale test. This is very situational, but there are going to be situations where you use it. The last thing that we're going to talk about is Voracious Appetite. This is the other thing you should be saving CP on almost any time you get stuck in with a Tyranid monster. It just gives you reroll failed wound rolls on a monster. So it's awesome. It's one of the greatest stratagems, one of the best stratagems in the Codex, if not the best right now, to be honest. And almost any time you have a very impactful fight phase with a monster, you should probably be saving a CP for this. Especially for the Haruspex, who makes so many attacks that you could potentially be generating a bunch of rerolls from it. This stratagem is excellent. So combining this with Feeding the Hunger, you get full rerolls on the Haruspex. So potentially, 8 Maw attacks, rerolling hits, rerolling wounds, into that many shoveling claw attacks, rerolling hits, rerolling wounds. Potentially a massive amount of damage from this thing. It can be highly, highly reliable once it gets stuck into melee. Downside is that that's 2 CP every time it fights to get to that level of reliability, which is a big ask. They're also stratagems, so you can't use them elsewhere in your army when you're doing that. So if this guy gets stuck in the same turn that, your Smashing Hive Tyrant or your Dimacaron or something else is already in melee, you have to make a decision which gets Voracious Appetite. Now, talking about some other unit-specific synergies, the first thing we want to do with this guy, because it is a tanky profile, is make it more difficult to kill. And there are a couple ways that Tyranids have to do that. We love our defensive auras over here in Bug Nation. We have Venomthropes and Malanthropes for their Spore Cloud ability to give it -1 to be hit. Not as big a deal in 9th edition as it was in 8th, but you can kind of use it alongside Dense Cover to sort of apply a universal -1 to be hit across your entire army. It also sometimes can really bone enemies that are relying on bonuses to hit, because you can stack multiple penalties to hit on top of each other. So there are situations where getting an additional -1 on a big thing like this could potentially matter. As long as you're running a pure Hive Fleet, typically you're going to want to try to fit a unit of Venomthropes or a Malanthrope in your list. The other way we have to keep this guy alive, and in this case, its toughness 8 is going to be a big deal, is the Maleceptor. Now, the Maleceptor itself doesn't really do anything for it, but it does give you access to the Encephalic Diffusion Stratagem, which will give it anything targeting stuff within 6 inches of the Maleceptor -1 strength. Now, the reason this is such a big deal is because the Haruspex is toughness 8. There's a big difference in how effective Encephalic Diffusion is on your army, depending on your toughness. With the majority of anti-tank weapons right now coming in at strength 8, giving them -1 toughness means they're going to be moving from wounding toughness 8 monsters on 4s to moving to 5s. In addition, you can stack them on top of -1 to be hit, so you're hitting them. You're basically giving -1 to hit and -1 to wound with a strength 8 weapon. If it was toughness 7, things like las cannons at strength 9 would not be affected by Encephalic Diffusion because they'd be wounding on 3s either way. But because this is toughness 8, if you have a strength 9 weapon shooting at it, they're going to be wounding on 4s as well. And if you're strength 5 like a heavy bolter, they're going to be wounding on 6s. So a lot of very important breakpoints for wound rolls in a lot of important weapon profiles in the game right now get really boned by -1 strength versus toughness 8. Now, the last synergy we're going to talk about, I feel like should go without saying, because it literally every Tyranid unit I could talk about it with, but that's Swarmlord. Swarmlord can make any unit move an additional time during the shooting phase. It can advance if it wants to, it can fall back, it can do any normal movement phase thing. It's a ridiculously powerful ability. And especially with melee units that are relatively slow, I think Swarmlord is basically a must-have to actually deliver them into melee. This thing will never get to melee with somebody who doesn't want them to without, a buff. Now, Swarmlord obviously doesn't do that great for shooting stuff. You can't shoot and use his ability, but if you're a melee unit, you want Swarmlord in your list. And that's it. If you're trying to deliver Haruspexes, put Swarmlord in there. He's going to make it a lot easier for you. Now, some other more generic synergies that you can find in the Tyranid faction for this. There are a couple very important psychic powers to use along with it. Catalyst is a big headliner. 5+ damage ignore for whatever you want. Excellent, especially for big multi-wound monsters, because a lot of times your opponent's going to convert 100% of your damage into wounds on that model. You will get a chance to ignore every point of damage that your opponent puts at you. So putting it on multi-wound models typically gets a little bit more use out of that Catalyst ability. The other big one is Onslaught, which I think is going to be basically required to deliver this the Haruspex in any reasonable amount of time. Onslaught allows you to advance and charge and shoot weapons without penalty. It's a really super useful ability. Honestly, when I started playing Tyranids, I kind of overlooked it. And then as soon as I started playing, I realized, oh my god, this this is really important for delivering the Tyranid units when you need them to. And being able to advance and charge the Haruspex is a big deal. If you have Swarmlord, that doubles the effectiveness. You could advance in the movement phase and then also advance in the charge phase. You do have to declare the first advance before you know whether or not Onslaught is going to successfully cast. So there is a little bit of gambling there if you want to do that. But I mean, that increases its average threat range to closer to 30 inches, which is really where you want to be going with a unit like this. So moving on from psychic powers to stratagems, and again, we'll talk about these Hive Fleet specific psychic powers once we get to each individual Hive Fleet. But let's talk about some stratagems that can affect it pretty well. And a lot like the other abilities that we just talked about, a lot of these will sort of universally affect the Tyranid faction. Tyranids have some pretty good stratagems, and they impact a great swath of Tyranid units. There's not a lot of very hyper-specific stratagems, and we already talked about the very specific ones earlier in the video. The first one we'll talk about is probably the most important stratagem in the Tyranid Codex, I think, Metabolic Overdrive. That allows you for 1 CP to move a unit again in the movement phase after it has moved already, and that's great. You can't charge or shoot after you do so, but if all you want to do is jump this thing from cover to cover and you don't need it to charge that turn, it's going to greatly increase the amount of table that it can threaten. Rapid Regeneration is a stratagem that lets you heal a Tyranid model for D3 wounds for 2 CP. Oh, this stratagem is way too expensive, but one thing that we'll talk about is that you can kind of push through a regeneration theme with a Haruspex pretty hardcore, and having access to that rapid regeneration, if you need it, if you want to, keep that Haruspex going as long as possible, could potentially be very useful. Usually this is only really used if you super need to bump a monster back up to a higher bracket. And that's even, and for 2 CP, it affects at the end of your movement phase. I mean, it's just it's a bad stratagem, to be honest. But because the Haruspex already heals a lot, you could potentially be healing a lot of wounds on it with it. Hunter's Drive and Hive Instinct can both potentially help deliver melee units. Both highly situational, but for 1 CP, you can potentially help deliver this guy a little bit better. Once you get in there, you have a lot of buffs to take advantage of. You have Adrenaline Surge, which I think is actually very important to mention with the Haruspex specifically, because the Haruspex is already relying on so many other stratagems to combo together to really impact, to get the most impact out of its fight phase. And Adrenaline Surge lets you reuse all those stratagems. So if you sink it into a big unit of guys, you're trying to live the dream and, hit a unit and blow up a tank, you dump the Feeding, the Hunger, and Voracious Appetite both on it to reroll hits and wounds. Then Adrenaline Surge lets you reroll those hits and wounds again. It lets you double dip on your stratagems. And because this is probably the most stratagem-hungry melee unit almost in the Codex, I think, having Adrenaline Surge open for it for the turns where it wants to maximize its damage, I think is going to be a big deal. The Haruspex, it's a pretty straightforward unit. It just wants to ram directly into your opponent's army and kill as much as it possibly can, and hopefully survive a little bit while it's doing that. And Savage Distraction is actually a really good stratagem to use while it's doing that. This lets you, when it destroys a unit, create an aura of -1 to hit with ranged attacks on your opponent's army. So if the Haruspex is, on an objective, potentially centrally located, killing stuff, just make it very difficult for your opponent to remain on that objective and stand there. Now, normally, big guns that you really want to hit with -1 to hit are usually going to be pretty far in the back, so I think it's going to be difficult to get there, but potentially there could be some situations where this is useful. Now, one way to get it to those big guns is using Overrun, which also triggers when you destroy a unit in the fight phase, and that lets you move as if it were the movement phase. So, if you really want to get all of these big auras super deep into your opponent's army, you could charge something, use all of your abilities to murder it hardcore, potentially like dumping an Adrenaline Surge into it if you really need to fight again. You could potentially be killing like 20 models with this guy with a fight twice, and then popping the Savage Distraction, overrunning it into the heart of your opponent's entire army and making them really spread out when they're trying to deal with it. Now that costs you like all your CP. We're talking 7 CP at the baseline here, which kind of sucks. But that is, potentially the ceiling of what the unit like the Haruspex can do. Now, obviously, there are a couple other stratagems that can affect this in a beneficial way elsewhere in the Codex. I'm not really going to talk about every single potential interaction that you have, because there's a lot of them that are just mostly not worth it, but these are the ones that jumped out to me immediately. But now that we talked about the stratagems, let's talk about some Hive Fleet abilities that really combo well with the Haruspex. Now, Hive Fleet Behemoth, I think, is kind of a fan favorite. A lot of people like playing Behemoth. It gives him reroll to charge, so that's good. It helps get this big dude into melee a little bit better. In addition, Unstoppable Hunger, the Hive Fleet Behemoth specific psychic power, can give it +1 to wound on a unit that makes so many melee attacks. That's a really big deal. It's not the greatest target for it. Obviously, if you have any units that benefit from +1 to wound, that have rending abilities, for example, those usually are where you want to be putting that psychic power if you get it off. But if this is stuck in and is about to maul your opponent's army, sure, go ahead and use it. It's a melee buff on a melee unit, so you can't really go wrong. Now, similarly to Hive Fleet Behemoth, Hive Fleet Kraken can help deliver this guy in melee as well, and does so a little bit better than Behemoth does itself, I think. Hive Fleet Kraken gives it a 3d6 and pick the highest for advances. In addition, you can use Opportunistic Advance to then double the amount that you roll on that advance roll. With Onslaught, like we talked about before, you could potentially be going a really long distance with that advance, and then using Synaptic Lure to reroll its charges just like you were in Behemoth. So if you really, if you want to deliver any melee unit, Hive Fleet Kraken is the way to go. You can also fall back and charge with Hive Fleet Kraken, but it's probably not that much of an issue, because I think mostly the Haruspex, if it's in melee, It's going to want to stay there. Hive Fleet Gorgon actually helps it quite a bit. Really kind of removes the need to use Voracious Appetite on this thing, especially anytime it's in a low toughness melee unit. It gives you reroll 1s to wound across your entire army, and so with its Shoveling Claws, those wound almost anything in the game that's not toughness 8 on its top profile on 2s, so rerolling 1s to wound is full rerolls essentially, and its Bite Attack is coming in at strength 7, so it's going to be wounding any toughness 3 thing on 2s, excuse me. So most of its attacks are going to be wounding on 2s, rerolling 1s with Hive Fleet Gorgon. It's a little bit awkward once you get to toughness 8 or toughness 4 infantry, because then I think you might want to be considering Voracious Appetite, but reroll 1s, it's probably fine. You can probably get away with that. In addition, the Hive Fleet Gorgon Psychic Power Poisonous Influence can give it an additional AP. Given that its Bite Attack is only AP 1, putting it to AP 2 makes it a lot more reliable at killing 3+ armor saves, which is really where you want to be. And it lets you ignore AP 1 abilities like the Salamander's Forged in Battle Chapter Tactic. Hive Fleet Leviathan helps buff its defensive profile a little bit by giving it a situational 6+ damage ignore. That's superseded by Catalyst if you ever have it, but Hive Fleet Leviathan is nice to have around for sure. Hive Fleet Leviathan can also give you a sort of a semblance of the Gorgon ability with War on All Fronts. So if you have a flying unit in addition to the Haruspex in melee with the same unit, you can give reroll 1s to hit and wound. Hive Fleet Kronos actually has basically no synergy with the poor Haruspex. It has 1 Assault 1 ranged attack, which you are never going to Symbio Storm and never going to stand still with to get the Hive Fleet ability. But I actually do think the Haruspex has some weird kind of meta synergy with Hive Fleet Kronos, and that is because a lot of the things that Hive Fleet Kronos wants to put on the table are toughness 8 monsters. I mean, specifically Exocrines. It wants to put Exocrines on the table, and there is something to be said for presenting a united front to your opponent. So if you have an entire army that is toughness 8, -1 to be hit with Shrouding Spore abilities, and -1, potentially -1 to be wounded from Encephalic Diffusion, or the equivalent of -1 to be wounded, that's a very difficult profile to shoot through, and it essentially negates all of your opponent's anti-infantry shooting. So if you're building an army around Exocrines already, putting other toughness 8 frontline units in your army is already good. In addition, we already talked about how much the Haruspex wants to ram up the table directly into your opponent's face. And having a tanky unit like that to project the Deepest Shadow aura off of is actually pretty useful. It's putting a thing in the best Hive Fleet makes a ton of sense. Obviously, there are a lot of custom Hive Fleet abilities that interact well with monsters. The most important ones, I think, are Feeding Frenzy, which is a little bit of an interesting one. Because this is a single model unit, there's going to be some situations where your opponent can beat it out of combat, essentially. So, like, if you charge a single unit with two of your units, and the Haruspex does not fight first, or maybe it's 2 Haruspexes, and you don't have a good option, and one of them kills a bunch of models, the second one will then not get to fight if your opponent's able to pull outside of 4 inches of it. Feeding Frenzy lets you get around that. So you can kind of commit multiple big monsters into a single infantry unit without those monsters getting totally pulled out of combat immediately. Metamorphic Regrowth helps you stack regeneration a little bit more. The Haruspex can already potentially heal 2 wounds a turn by itself, maybe an additional D3 if you use the Stratagem on it, and Metamorphic Regrowth stacks that to an additional 1, so you could potentially be regenerating 3 plus D3 wounds a turn, and you can buff that even farther. I do like that one if you're running a lot of monsters, because it makes you able to shrug off like incidental damage a lot of times. Like, a lot of times your opponent will have 10 bolter shots to shoot into a monster, and sometimes they pink a wound off you, and Metamorphic Regrowth just wipes all that away really nicely. Prey Sight is the big headliner here, I think. Gives you +1 to hit with a monster on the charge, or the first round of combat if your are charged or heroically intervene, and that is a godsend for this thing. Even if you're rerolling all your hit rolls, only a 75% conversion rate at your top profile, its weapon skill can degrade pretty quickly, is really bad. So getting to a 3+ weapon skill to start with, that's so much nicer. I think most of the time, if I was going to build a list specifically around running Haruspexes, I would very, very strongly consider a Prey Sight custom Hive Fleet in there to get the most use out of it. Now, obviously, also in the Codex, or in Blood of Ball at least, there are adaptive physiologies that you can use to buff up your monsters. talk about some important ones for the Haruspex. First one is Dermic Symbiosis. This is, I think, a fan favorite for everybody running monsters. It gives you a 5+ invulnerable save, which is excellent against all of the big AP anti-tank weaponry that we're seeing right now. In addition, it also gives you the Iron Hands bracketing rule, so you double your wounds for bracketing. That makes it very difficult to bracket these things down. You have to get it down to 3 wounds to get it to its second bracket, so you have to almost kill it. You have to deal 10 damage to it to bracket this thing. The other one is Accelerated Digestion. This is, again, if you want to stack the regeneration theme onto your Haruspex Hardcore. That one lets it regenerate a wound as soon as it destroys a model in the fight phase up to 3 wounds. And that also combos with its own regeneration at the end of the fight phase. So it could be potentially regenerating 4 wounds in the fight phase, 1 wound in the shooting phase, and D3 wounds in the movement phase, plus 1 if you already have Metamorphic Regrowth on it. So doing the math quickly in my head, that's 6 plus D3, so, you know, potentially 7 wounds. You could deal, you could half kill this thing. It could regenerate back up to full with all those abilities in play. That's really cool. I don't know if it's very good. I think a lot of times this thing's going to commit and then immediately die. So I wouldn't quite recommend that to you, but I think it's a really interesting strategy to try to adopt. So with that, we've talked about all of the abilities of the Haruspex, all of the synergies in Tyranids that you can use alongside it. Let's talk about the final verdict. Is the Haruspex worth putting in a Tyranid army? And the answer is, I don't know, probably not. This is a significant meh from me, I think. The upside and the potential of the Haruspex are prodigious, and it's exciting to think about how much damage it could be doing to your opponent's army. Like, I could make 24 attacks with this guy, 12 D6 damage, big punchy, strength 14, like Dreadnought close combat weapon equivalents. Like, this is sick. This guy could be ripping apart, 2 units at a time. How cool is that? But realistically, it's never going to do that. And honestly, I think the profile as a whole is a big miss from Games Workshop. There are a baffling number of just abysmal stats on its datasheet for kind of no reason. Like, for a melee monster specifically, the monster keyword being largely a debuff because it makes it more difficult for you to get around terrain, and especially for a unit that doesn't have any guns on it. Making it so slow in light of that, it really makes it difficult to see it getting up the table. Now, obviously, it trades that slowness for tankiness, but at 170 points, I don't really want to just be relying on my opponent to, like, roll bad damage, to keep my monster alive so it can actually get to melee. The other thing is the weapon skill 4. And I mentioned this at the top of the video, but a big issue with Tyranids right now is that a lot of their buffs, almost all of their army synergies are based around finite resources. One of them being adaptive physiologies, which take out the slots of other abilities that you could be using. One of them takes up your warlord trait, one of them eats a CP to start the game, and you only get 2. So a lot of times when you're building a Tyranid army, the first thing you think about is where your 2 adaptive physiology slots are going, and the Haruspex probably has to take up one of those. The other thing is that a lot of Tyranid units are also tied to CP. For example, we talked about the Maleceptor earlier in the video, and that essentially bleeds you 2 CP every turn that you use it, because you want to, if you include it in the army, you're probably doing it for Encephalic Diffusion, which costs you 2 CP a turn. And the Haruspex is no different. The Haruspex bleeds you 1 CP every time it fights to reroll its hit rolls, because its weapon skill is so garbage. And it potentially bleeds you another one for Voracious Appetite as well. And if you want to trigger any of those cool abilities, you want to trigger your Grizzly Feast, if you want to trigger cool Savage Distraction to get a big -1 to hit aura on your opponent's army, like, those are all really cool abilities, but they all cost you your CP, and you only start with 12 of those things. So why it doesn't have, just an ability that says, like, when you allocate an attack against infantry, the weapon skill of that attack becomes 2+, that would make this so much better. That would help this profile so much. In addition, it's just too expensive, I think. It's 170 points for a melee-only unit. It's just too many points, and not a particularly phenomenal melee unit at that. I mean, it's going to plink some stuff up, it's going to kill some intercessors and generate some extra attacks, but it's not going to, like, crush you through your opponent's army, and for almost 200 points, I kind of want something that's gonna really give my opponent a tough time, and I just don't think the Haruspex is it. The potential of the Haruspex is great. It looks like a really fun unit to play, to be honest. Just being able to like trigger a bunch of abilities, like sequential abilities, is something that I really enjoy. I like combo-oriented play like that. And if you can get it stuck into like a big unit of orc boys and it just goes ham and adrenaline surges and kills 30 models, like more power to you, man. If you can get that done, do it to it. But I think personally, especially if I was going to play a competitive Tyranid list, I would not be putting a Haruspex in my list. But one of the things that came out of this review actually was that I was a little bit more impressed with the Haruspex holistically. Anytime I'm building a list, there's always something better than a Haruspex to put in it. And so you sort of get to the point where you kind of discount the Haruspex every time you think about it. But really, it's not that bad. Especially in Tyranids, there are some significantly worse things that you could be putting in your army than a Haruspex. So that's going to do it for this datasheet deep dive. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. And let me know down in the comments what you think about, first of all, non-Space Marine datasheet we're talking about. That's sick. What do you think about the Haruspex itself? Do you like the model? I mean, I think it's pretty cool. And I would like to put some on the table in the not too distant future. Obviously, it's not the greatest model ever, but it does look pretty fun to play. And looking at all the interesting synergies, I think you could build some cool lists around it. Like I mentioned at the top, big thanks to my patrons for supporting the channel and helping me get through the really terrible technological situation I was in and improve things for the channel. If you want to make suggestions for datasheet deep dive topics to cover in the future, you can head on over to patreon.com/tacticaltortoise and join the community over there. You get access to not only being able to select topics for datasheet deep dive, but you also get access to some exclusive content. I create patron exclusive versions of each of these videos that I put some bloopers in and stuff like that, which is super fun. You get those. We got a special channel in the Discord just for patron members. If you want some other stuff as well, we do have a YouTube membership you can join at the link down below the video. That gives you some exclusive badges and emojis that you can use on the channel. And with my plan to live stream a little bit more often, I think you'll have some more opportunities to use those. So thanks again for watching, everyone. Hope you enjoyed the video. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.